Devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. How to Practice the Sacred Heart Devotion by Father John Croiset, Part 8. And so we left off with the 4 parts, 4 dispositions that are needed for the devotion to the Sacred Heart to take root in the soul. And they are a hatred of sin. Secondly, a lively faith. Third, a great desire to love Jesus Christ ardently. And fourthly, interior recollection, which they had a lot to say about. Interior recollection. They, meaning Father John Croiset. So now, what are the obstacles in chapter 2 that prevent us from deriving all the fruit we should from the devotion to the Sacred Heart? What prevents us from experiencing the benefits of this? As this devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus is extremely useful, easy, reasonable, and solid, there are few really virtuous people who do not approve of it, few who do not practice it, but all do not feel that ardent love for Jesus Christ, nor that true sweetness which Jesus Christ makes those whom he loves experience, although these singular favors are the fruit of devotion to the Sacred Heart. What are the fruit of the devotion to the Sacred Heart? To feel that ardent love for Jesus Christ. To feel the true sweetness which Jesus Christ makes those whom he loves experience. These singular favors are the fruit of devotion to his Sacred Heart. Everything which prevents souls from making progress in virtue is an obstacle to the great graces which this devotion procures for us. And these obstacles which few people surmount, overcome. These obstacles which few overcome dry up the source of these great graces and are the reason why God communicates himself intimately only to few. So if there is an obstacle, and they're going to identify the obstacles, you won't experience this. 1 second. Now, one second. Okay. So now you see what Jesus is trying to communicate to you. He's actually to give you a sensible, to feel it, to feel the sweetness of his love. I want to make a mark on that. Of course, I can't find my pen. All do not feel that ardent love for Jesus Christ. All do not feel the true sweetness which Jesus Christ makes those whom he loves experience. So, feeling the ardent love for Jesus Christ and the true sweetness which Christ makes those whom he loves experience. So there I have it. I've broken it down. True sweetness, and to feel that ardent love for Jesus Christ. Okay, there you have it. What are the fruits of devotion to the Sacred Heart? One of it is to feel that ardent love for Jesus Christ. And the other one is to feel the true sweetness which Jesus Christ makes those experience whom he loves. Okay, there you have it. That if we're not feeling that, those two things, feel that ardent love for Jesus Christ or the true sweetness which he makes those souls whom he loves experience, we're doing something wrong. Paragraph 2. People have been long complaining that they no longer feel in the practices of devotion that heavenly sweetness which the saints have tasted, and which, although they are only the trappings of sanctity, they are only the dressing on the cake, nevertheless have served much to form saints. Don't discredit it. Those consolations, don't write them off. They are the trappings of sanctity. But nevertheless, they have served, he says, much to form saints. So don't discredit those feelings that come with this devotion, because he's saying that you should. Some people experience only dryness, lukewarmness, and aversion for the exercise of piety. They find no consolation, no sweetness in prayer, no feeling of devotion either at communion or Mass. They experience coldness and indifference in all that should cause the greatest pleasure and excite eagerness. Okay? So he's saying this devotion should cause the greatest pleasure. What is pleasure? It's a sensible thing, right? And excite eagerness. Don't settle for dryness with this. What do people do? They try to console themselves with the thought that sanctity does not consist in sensible devotion. Oh, please hear what I'm saying here. They try to say, and I've heard this from priests, you're going through a period of dryness. Well, this man, chosen by Christ to write this book, says, don't settle for that. People try to console themselves, and people are consoled by clergy, I'll add, with the thought that sanctity doesn't consist in sensible devotion. Father Croiset says, it is true that one can be a great saint and never have sensible devotion. But when we are every day so cowardly and imperfect, we have reason to believe that it is in punishment of our cowardice that God does not grant us those interior consolations and spiritual sweetness which would help much to make us more courageous and more perfect. Let me read that maybe 2 more times. He's arguing against that statement. Don't worry about it. You're just going through a period of dryness, tepid, lukewarmness. Father says, no. Don't try to console yourselves with the thought that sanctity does not consist in sensible devotion. Although it's true that one can be a great saint and never have had sensible devotion, Father says, but when we are every day so cowardly and imperfect, we have reason to believe that it is in punishment from God of our cowardice that God does not grant us those interior consolations and spiritual sweetness which would help to make us more courageous and more perfect. I'll read it one more time. When we have no sensible devotion from this, and we are every day so cowardly and imperfect, he's saying when this goes on, we have reason to believe it's a punishment from God. Why? Due to cowardice. that God does not grant us those interior consolations and spiritual sweetness which would help to improve our spiritual life. That's what he's saying. These things would help us to be more perfect and more courageous, but it's in punishment of our what? Cowardice. In punishment of our cowardice, that God does not grant us this spiritual consolation and this sweetness, which would help to make us more perfect. Punishment. Wow. Punishment for cowardice. The way of perfection today is not different from that by which the saints have walked. They all confess that it is not possible to imagine greater pleasure than that tasted in the service of God. They all say, oh, what sweetness there is in the service of God. They don't hesitate to say that they are filled with such sweetness that the greatest labors are delights, that they do not know what disrelish or melancholy is, that what appears most repulsive causes a pure and perfect joy that cannot be troubled by the most vexatious occurrences. Now I know why Father Claude de la Colombière says to say to Jesus, my Lord, either give me what I'm asking for, or make me so content without it that I neither feel the weight and the sting of not having it. Now I see why he says this. They assure us, the saints, who feel this great love and ardor, even in the most abject circumstances, they assure us that the most terrible trials which God sends them have their sweetness and consolation, that nothing but sin can trouble the peace which they enjoy, and that God himself inspires them with such great confidence in his mercy that their own faults cannot trouble their peace. Very important. This is an important, the obstacles which prevent us from deriving all the fruits we should from the devotion to the Sacred Heart. So, he identified one, and that's cowardice in the service of God. These are not merely the sentiments of a few people. They are the experiences of all the true servants of God, of all times, of every age and quality, of every country and of every walk of life. And these experiences of heavenly sweetness have been confirmed at the hour of their death, which is the time when people are most sincere. What reason could we have to imagine that people so wise, people universally recognized to be upright and virtuous, would either wish to deceive us or that they were themselves deceived? Can then any reasonable person doubt the truth of a fact so well established, when there is such a very great number of irreproachable witnesses who all speak with like uniformity during such a long succession of centuries? In other words, he's saying, it's true. These people experience this sweetness in the most horrible circumstances of their lives. So he's saying, believe it. Whence comes it then that among such a great number of people who in our time make profession of piety and appear to walk in the footsteps of these saints, so few are found who receive the same graces? The reason, doubtless, is that there are few whose virtue is really solid, Okay, that's another obstacle. So cowardice is one. The reason is that there are few whose virtue is really solid. And so we're going to put that as an obstacle to the devotion of the Sacred Heart, of getting the sweetness out of it. So he's condemning lack of solid virtue. Okay. The reason, doubtless, is that there are few whose virtue is really solid. Holiness does not consist in these sensible devotions, no. But it is nonetheless true that interior joy and peace, which all the accidents of life cannot trouble, that perfect submission to the will of God and sweet confidence in His mercy, which are characteristic of sensible devotion, have always been the inheritance of the saints, and are still the privilege of all true servants of God. He's saying you can say all you want that it doesn't make absolutely for the pious soul. He's saying that, yes, this is not an absolute necessity, but it's a fruit. The reason why people don't experience this is because there are few whose virtue is really solid. Holiness does not, it is true, he says, consist in these sensible devotions. But it is nonetheless true that interior joy and interior peace, which all the accidents of life can't trouble, that perfect submission to the will of God and sweet confidence in His mercy, which are characteristic of sensible devotion, have always been the inheritance of the saints, and are still the privilege of all the true servants of God. We have already seen what great sweetness is found in the devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. That is to say, that the fruit of devotion, of this devotion in particular, is a very ardent and very tender love of Jesus Christ, accompanied by interior joy, heavenly consolations, sweet and unchanging peace, which surpass all understanding, all which are gifts inseparable from the perfect love of Jesus Christ. He's saying that this is the fruit of it. We are going to consider what are the obstacles that prevent people from reaping this fruit. All these obstacles may be reduced to 4. Great tepidity in the service of God, self-love, secret pride, and certain passions which people have not taken care to mortify from the beginning of their conversion. From these 4 heads, as from the 4 fatal fountains, proceed all those faults and imperfections which stop so many souls on the road of piety, which shipwreck the finest projects and the most generous resolutions, and finally, which render unfruitful the holiest practices of devotion. So now we're going to talk about these 4 obstacles. And the object of reading these is to identify those in your own soul and to root them out. Now, they will be too many pages to read. So I'll break it up. The first obstacle, tepidity. Tepid. You get up, you don't want to pray. Obstacles. One, tepid. As the devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus is a continual exercise of ardent love of God, it is evident that tepidity, the great obstacle to the ardent love of God, is also a great obstacle to acquiring true devotion to the Sacred Heart. or deriving any profit from it. Although the Son of God has an infinite hatred for sin, he has not a hatred for the sinner. He calls him, he seeks him, he has compassion on him. But his divine heart cannot endure a tepid soul. He says, I would thou wert cold or hot, says our Savior, but because thou art lukewarm, and neither cold nor hot, I will begin to vomit thee out of my mouth. Apocalypse, chapter 3, 15. The heart of Jesus seeks pure souls capable of loving him. The Sacred Heart of Jesus is always liberal. He desires souls which are in a state to receive its favors, and which have the dispositions necessary for arriving at the degree of perfection to which he destines them. These dispositions are not found in a soul that lives in tepidity. A tepid soul is in a state of blindness, caused by the passions which tyrannize over the soul, by the continual dissipation in which it lives, by the multitude of venial sins which it commits, and by the withdrawal of the graces of heaven brought on it by the soul's own resistance. This blindness brings about the formation of a false conscience, causing people, even those who frequent the sacraments, to remain for many years in serious venial sins, hidden or disguised by passion, because these people have neither the will nor the courage to correct them. We sometimes see religious or seculars who make a profession of piety, nourishing secret aversions, envenomed jealousy, dangerous attachments, a spirit of bitterness and murmuring against superiors, self-love and pride which influence all their actions, and other faults of this nature, in the midst of which they live peacefully, persuading themselves or trying to persuade themselves that there is nothing very criminal in all of this, and seeking for reasons to excuse faults which nevertheless God condemns as sinful, and which they themselves will condemn at the hour of death, when passion will no longer prevent them from seeing things as they are in themselves. What renders this state more dangerous, and what compels Jesus Christ to reject the tepid soul from his heart, is that this tepid soul is, in a certain sense, desperate, because tepidity is rarely ever cured. As sins committed by a tepid soul are not gross and scandalous, such as excite horror in a timorous soul, a sensitive soul, but are often purely interior and take place only in the heart, they escape the attention of a lax conscience, or of a soul not attentive to itself. Thus, as it does not know the greatness of its evils, it takes no pain to remedy them, whereas a great sinner is more in a state to be touched by his disorders, and to conceive a horror for them because he knows them. It is in this sense that our Savior says that it is better to be cold than to be tepid. I want to read that part again. A tepid soul is in a state of blindness, caused by the passions which tyrannize over it, by the continual dissipation in which it lives, by the multitude of venial sins which it commits, and by the withdrawal of the graces of heaven brought on it by its own resistance to grace. This blindness brings about the formation of a false conscience, causing people in this state, even those who frequent the sacraments, to remain for many years in serious venial sins, hidden or disguised by passion, because these people have neither the will nor the courage to correct them. You'll even hear people like this say, I can't pray for him. No, I don't like him. There's a guy who goes to church. I've heard that. We sometimes see religious or seculars who make a profession of piety, nourishing secret aversions, hatreds, envenomed jealousies, dangerous attachments, a spirit of bitterness and murmuring against superiors, self-love and pride which influence all their actions, and other faults of this nature, in the midst of which they live peacefully, persuading themselves or trying to persuade themselves that there is nothing very criminal in all of this, and seeking for reasons to excuse faults which nevertheless God condemns as sinful, and which they themselves will condemn at the hour of death, when they will be more honest with themselves. What renders this state more dangerous, and what compels Jesus Christ to reject this tepid soul, is that it is in a certain sense desperate, because tepidity or lukewarmness is rarely ever cured, as sins committed by a tepid or lukewarm soul are not gross and scandalous that would excite horror in a more sensitive soul, but are often purely interior and take place only in the heart. They escape the attention of this lax, tepid conscience, or of a soul not attentive to itself. Thus, as it does not know the greatness of its evils, it takes no pain to remedy them, whereas a great sinner is more in a state to be touched by his disorders, and to conceive a horror for them, because he knows them. It is in this sense that our Savior says that it is better to be cold than to be tepid. The most solid practices of devotion are useless to a person who is in this unhappy lukewarm state, whether it be that he has lost all relish for them because of the little fruit with which he derives from them, or because too great familiarity with these holy exercises breeds contempt. Even the great and terrible truths of salvation, which by their novelty and force strike terror into the hearts of the greatest sinners, make scarcely any impression on the lukewarm soul, because such a soul has been so often and so fruitlessly appealed to. Yeah, I know about hell. I know, but then there's God's mercy, right? That's a tepid soul. As soon as a person begins to live in lukewarmness, he seeks himself in everything. He continually looks for what will give pleasure. He surpasses the sensual in seeking his own comforts and his self-love. Not being weakened by being bestowed on exterior objects, concentrates itself on himself and applies itself entirely to thinking out a nice, comfortable life. It is easy to see that a soul in this state, insensible to the most terrible truths of salvation, and still more insensible to the striking proofs of the love which Jesus Christ has for us, is too far from the dispositions needed for the devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus to draw any fruit from it. The marks by which a person can recognize whether he is in this dangerous state of lukewarmness are the effects which it usually produces on the tepid soul. Are you any of the following? Great negligence in all spiritual exercises? Do you listen to sermons? Do you read spiritual things each day? Or do you have an aversion to like, oh, I gotta read that? 2. Now let me continue with 1. Great negligence in all spiritual exercises, prayers said without attention, confessions without amendment, communions without preparation, without fervor, and without fruit. 2. Continual dissipation of spirit which is scarcely ever attentive either to itself or to God. Never thinking that God is with you, but which becomes engrossed indifferently in all kinds of objects and occupies itself with 1,000 trifles. 3. A perverse habit of doing all one's actions without any interior spirit, but by whim or custom, and of taking no pains to prevent passion, self-love and human respect having their share. 4. Laziness in acquiring the virtues proper to one's state. 5. Disgust for spiritual things, and particularly an indifference, you don't care, to the great virtues. In the state of this lukewarmness, the yoke of Jesus Christ begins to feel heavy. The exercises of piety become a burden. The maxims of the gospel about hating oneself, love of the cross and of the humiliations, and the need to do violence to oneself and to walk in the straight path appear inconceivable to the lukewarm soul. The continual exercise of modesty, mortification, and interior recollection are found to be impossible to do. The lives of solidly virtuous people are regarded as unhappy people, and the practice of virtue almost impossible. 6. Insensibility of conscience to little things. This person is no longer affected by his ordinary infidelities or by his relapses. Cursing, it's only a venial sin. Not to worry. He easily allows himself to commit all kinds of deliberate venial sins. But how it ought to be feared that all these faults, want of delicacy of conscience, facility to relapse into the same faults and to confess them without correcting them, negligence, contempt for little things, indifference for great virtues, infidelity in the exercise of piety, repeated loss of fervor, may be visible marks of a dying faith and of charity that is almost gone. How it should be feared that this state of lukewarmness or tepidity may insensibly lead to that of hardness of heart and insensibility. This unhappy state is all the more dangerous because people do not know it enough, nor fear its fatal effects. Thus, those who have no taste for this devotion to the Sacred Heart, and those who practice it but derive no fruit from it, have reason to fear that their lukewarmness is the obstacle which causes these effects. As the fatal cause of this unhappy state often comes from deep-seated self-love, the means given in the following chapter to kill or at least mortify this self-love will serve as a remedy for this lukewarmness, this deadly spiritual disease, since true mortification and fervor are inseparable. What has been said about this lukewarmness or tepidity is taken from the spiritual retreats of Father Nepveu, Nepveu, Society of Jesus. The following additional reflections may be found useful. Number 1, it's strange that many religious who have left all for God should prefer to deprive themselves of great graces and consolations rather than sacrifice little things which stop them on the road to perfection and prevent them from tasting the holy joy which is the lot of the fervent servants of God. 2, it is no less strange that people who have made great sacrifices to assure their salvation and merit a happy death sometimes die with regret and trouble, and this for lack of a little more generosity. 3, what is it that hinders us? Persons in religion frequently have good desires, but because of cowardice, such as people of the world who would not think religious capable of, they fail to put them into practice. We have sometimes begun to serve God well. All those times were we endeavoring to deceive people? If God had been the true motive of our conversion, how comes it that with such a motive we do not persevere? 4, truly either the saints have done too much or we do not do enough to be saints. But you will say a person would have to be a saint to live as the saints have lived. Let us rather say we must make ourselves saints, and it is only by living as the saints have lived that we can do so. This goes on, number 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. But I have to get ready for Mass. And we will continue this on the next part, because this is something that has to be read repeatedly, or to make notes and to go over the notes for it to sink in. This is not something you can just read once and you got it. Okay, I got it. No, it's a manual. It's a manual to be applied to daily living. It's literally, I would call it a manual for living. And hey, you have it on the audio file. You can listen to this whenever. It's good stuff. And so I'll stop there. It's awesome. It's awesome.